All right, I see that we have some viewers in the room, so I'm just going to go ahead and welcome everybody and get us started. Thank you, everyone, for joining the 2024 Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar hosted by WestAF. Today, we're here for our first session out of 3 in a webinar series for the first half of 2024. And I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Cynthia Chen. I'm the Manager of Public Policy and Advocacy at WestAF. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an Asian American woman wearing glasses, and today I'm joining from Washington, D.C., which is the lands of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank. And I'll just go ahead and do some few housekeeping items. If you need closed captioning, that is available to you locally on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And we have we'll be doing Q&A later in the session through the chat function, and that should be on the left-hand navigation bar. And this session will be recorded and shared afterwards. So you will have options to watch again if you want to share with folks in your network, all of that. So with that, I want to go ahead and welcome all of the folks from the WestAF community, whether it's the general public, friends in different state arts agencies, our state's arts advocates. And just as a brief introduction to the Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar, last year we, as WestAF, hosted a fly-in to Washington, D.C., but in 2022 and 2021, we did an online virtual learning session. And this year, as a continuation of that, we will be hosting 1-hour webinars this month, as well as in March and May, to continue learning and capacity building in arts advocacy. And we hope that this is an opportunity for folks to understand the current landscape of federal arts advocacy and cultural policy, as well as to get some approaches about how to successfully advocate and lobby on behalf of arts and culture. And so for today's panel, we're doing a session about advocacy outside of our cultural agencies. And so whether that be the federal cultural agencies, the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment for the Humanities, or our state arts agencies. So every state typically has an arts agency that does grants and funding as well. And so today we're here to talk about what are some opportunities that we have to advocate for arts and culture outside of those agencies. Yes, those are some of the most important sources of public funding in our arts ecosystem, but of course there's a lot that we can do as advocates to continue to bolster our ecosystem. And so in today's session, we'll have some takeaways, hopefully practical examples, and we'll be providing also a bunch of resources for specific issues that we're going to cover today. And with that, I'm going to do a little bit of a primer, and then just to outline what's in store for us today, I'll move us into an introduction of our panelists. Well, they'll have a chance to talk about some of the experiences that they've had on the ground in the field, organizing around specific issues, and then we'll get going with the conversation. So just a little bit of a setup. Before we get started, I wanted to do a little bit of context and level setting for everybody when we're talking about different types of advocacy. When we say regulatory advocacy, what do we mean? When we say budget advocacy, what do we mean? Legislative advocacy, what does that mean? So just broadly, when in this conversation today, when we're talking about budget advocacy, that's when we're advocating for the public funds that will be allocated to a specific agency or program. When we're talking about legislative advocacy, we're talking about advocacy to create new laws, shaping bills, and that kind of thing. When we're talking about regulatory advocacy, we're talking about monitoring how, once a bill has been put in place, how those laws are interpreted by rules and regulations, and that's a little bit different. And then also something thinking about administrative advocacy. What does that mean? And that is when we are talking to the agencies that are implementing these programs, are there ways that we can advocate to make processes more accessible and smooth? So that's broadly, we're thinking about advocacy in these different buckets. And that's something we'll dive more into today. And finally, I wanted to do a little bit of a primer and point folks to a resource. Today, we'll be talking a little bit about regulations and something called the Register and where to find updates and rules and regulations. And just as an introduction, the Federal Register is something that is published every day by the federal government. It's kind of the newspaper of the federal government. They'll post updates on it's actually mandated that executive orders, proclamations, changes in rules and regulations must be published in this register, and it's publicly accessible. And that is a way that advocates can track what is happening in terms of rules and regulations. And I want to point folks to a resource that we have on the event website, as well as in the, we'll send that out afterwards, the event. You can read more about what is the Federal Register and what does it serve more there. So with that, I think I've done enough context setting. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. I'm going to go ahead and just go in alphabetical order, and I'm going to ask Alice to come off the mic and introduce herself. Thank you.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Sounds good. That's great. My name is, thank you, Cynthia. That was a great introduction. My name is ALAS24. My pronouns are she, her. I have dark hair. I'm wearing a bright orange atik look, or kaspak as many know. I'm Inupiaq from Nome, Alaska, and welcome. Glad and excited to be here.
Alice, in your introduction, I also think, can you talk a little bit about how you or your organization is engaged in advocacy outside of budgeting processes? And we'll get into more of that during the panel as well. Oh. But yes.
Sure, absolutely. I apologize. I work at COERC, or I'm employed at COERC, which is a regional nonprofit and tribal consortium serving the Bering Straits region of Alaska. We are authorized by 19 of the tribal councils to contract to provide services to their tribal membership. The COERC board itself consists of the presidents of each of the 20 councils. So we're very active in advocacy and pertaining to our discussion today. I bring a lens of advocacy through community planning and development within a tribal nonprofit organization.
Great, thanks, Alice. With that, I'll pass it over to Bertrand.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bertrand Evans Taylor. I use he, him pronouns, and I am an umber-skinned man with shaven black hair, a black beard, and a black polo. And I currently work at the Performing Arts Alliance, and we are an organization made up of about 20 art service organizations that come together to do advocacy on the federal level. And some of the advocacy that we do, it's a pretty broad slate of things outside of budget. Some things are very, very art specific, such as the white noise microphone issue, and the changing of those regulations to for the frequencies for wireless microphones, which of course affects anyone who uses a microphone wirelessly, as well as broader issues that don't only touch our industry, such as, like we'll talk about later, the attacks on transgender people across the nation, which of course includes transgender artists. And so I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Cynthia.
Thanks so much. Heather?
Hi, I'm Heather Noonan. I'm the Vice President for Advocacy for the League of American Orchestras, and we are the national service organization for the 2,000 orchestras in the U.S., from the largest professional orchestras to community-based and youth orchestras all over the country. And we are also a very proud partner in the Cultural Advocacy Group Federal Coalition with WETSTAF and the Performing Arts Alliance and a full array of organizations that work on cultural issues at the federal level. I'll just say the League's direct advocacy work is mostly focused at the federal level, but we do work to help build the capacity of our members to get engaged in local and state level policymaking, especially acknowledging that that policy moves fast and the arts always want to have a seat at the table. And there's also often a lot of connection between federal policy and state level activities. So we try to knit those things together. But when it comes to directly speaking up on the policy issues, most of our focus is going to be on the federal slate. As Bertrand mentioned, we too are focused on it's kind of a startling array of policy issues. Obviously, advocating for robust funding for the cultural agencies and dedicated funding for arts education at the U.S. Department of Education are a core advocacy activity always. But we're also very active in exploring all the ways the federal government can do more to support arts and culture. And we're also sometimes presented with frontline threats in agency action that directly impact the capacity of the arts. So some of those less likely or less well-known issues that we engage on relate to the artist visa process. We're always mindful of issues that are at the intersection of nonprofit tax status and cultural activities. And we even work actually quite a bit, both at the federal level and internationally, on how protected species policies intersect with musical instruments and other cultural objects. So that gives you an idea of the span of activity. And just to kind of wrap up where we started, every single one of those issues is advanced in really intentional coalitions and partnerships. So it's great to be here today with you and those folks watching this webinar are part of that network.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you all of our speakers. And I just wanted to reiterate and emphasize that what Heather said about the agencies, advocating for agencies being a core issue for the sector. But of course, I think one of the objectives when thinking about putting this panel together was trying to highlight some ways that we can continue to do advocacy when sometimes there are political or situations in the political environment that might make advocating for increased budget challenging. There are still ways that we can engage in advocacy. So I think in this first round of questions, I'm going to do pointed questions to each of you individually, and I'm going to go ahead and start with Heather. I would love for you to dive a little bit more deeply into what has been done around artist visa policy, and if you could tell us more about how that affects the sector, especially the performing arts, and if you can describe some of the work that that your organization has been leading, but then also has been doing in coalition with a lot of folks, maybe in the audience or even on this call, and engaging federal agencies on that issue.
Yeah, sure. So this issue around the required visas for international artists to perform and work in the United States has also been a bedrock issue for us in more ways than direct advocacy, because we're a national service organization and we support our members' capacity to do their art. We've been helping them understand how the visa process works from a technical assistance lens for a very long time. In fact, the League and our partners in the Performing Arts Alliance were at the table when the Immigration and Naturalization Act was revisited in 1991, and specific visa categories were created for artists. So starting with that legislative action, we had a very specific area of visa policy that was connected to artists and other individuals of extraordinary ability, including some scientists and researchers and so on. And from that moment, we were busy then in two non-legislative areas of that issue. One was really understanding how those rules worked so we could guide our members through navigating them. And that has eventually resulted in a website we manage called artistsfromabroad.org. And it's basically the ABCs of how to be in compliance with visa policy rules in a way that supports international cultural exchange. But it also set us immediately into dialogue with the Immigration Service about how they were going to administer those rules. So we worked with the U.S. labor organizations as well as our National Art Service organizations to come up with an approach to this policy area that we could discuss with the agency all the way from 1991 to today. So as everyone's probably aware, there have been very many talks about immigration reform on the Hill, and there have been years and years of roadblocks to progress because of complete disagreement about a path forward. And yet, over all those years, the Immigration Service continues to make policy, right, on how they're administering their work. And so that has been a big area of policy engagement for us. Some of that activity happens through the Federal Register. So, for instance, right now, the Immigration Service has proposed a massive fee increase, and they posted an announcement of that, inviting public comments before those fees are finalized. And that was our opportunity to get into the mix and talk to them, not just about the fees and what it would mean for our community, but what other areas of artist visa policymaking you'd like to see improved at a cost to our field. But then also we've been engaged in ongoing meetings with agency officials, and maybe get a little bit deeper into that in a little bit. But the idea here is that on that issue, we don't have to wait for the federal government to issue a proposed new policy to have a conversation with the agencies about the issues that matter. Through this technical assistance that we offer on how to get an artist visa, we identify pain points that help us design policy solutions that the agency can address without waiting for Congress to take action or give them some new authority to help us. So for this artist visa issue, the kind of three big parts that are making sure we're understanding how policy meets practice in the real world, documenting those concerns, coming forward with solutions, and using both the rulemaking process and meetings and relationship with agency officials to get those points across.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I wanted to highlight that in the chat, our West Staff team members have dropped a link to some resources where we've included a link to the Artists from Abroad to get more information about that. And also we've included an example of some of the work that Heather's organization in coalition with others have been working on in providing public comments to those fee increases, and including writing arguments about why how this the fee increases impact the sector, and as well as coalition recommendations for how we might improve performing artist visa policy. And I think it's really generous to volunteer that information. I think it's super helpful for everyone across the field to see how one might be able to, how we can all organize together and put comments together. And that's a theme in this panel as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to Alice. I'm going to just ask you a question. I know that you were active in organizing your community around proposed changes to the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which is a piece of legislation that is a truth in advertising law that makes it a federally protected to when something is native made. It codifies saying that if it's native made, there's certain definitions around that. And then I also know that you organized around changes in regulations for that administering agency. So the agency that administers that, that is in charge of administering that those programs. I just wanted to ask if you could tell the audience a little bit more about why the opportunity for to provide public comments to the federal government on this issue is important to your community, and if you could tell us a little bit more about how you were able to quickly activate your community when this public comment opportunity came up.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, the opportunity to comment was, the window was pretty small, so there was a need for a quick turnaround, but I just wanted to give some context around cultural advocacy, just to build the reason why I think it was important to respond to those comments. But working here at COERC, cultural advocacy involves promoting and protecting our thriving, living, and growing diverse Alaska Native communities. very, very human, very complicated advocacy work happens across the region, across the state when it comes to cultural advocacy. And I bring a lens of, community planning and development and the work that we do here at COERC. There are various methods and approaches to cultural advocacy we engage in based on the resources we have available. We're located in one of the most remote locations in the United States. And how we're able to do advocacy within the region and outside the region based on the resources that we have. But first and foremost, we are guided by our tribal leadership. We are tasked with advocating and promoting the arts. With our rich diversity in culture and language comes artwork that shares intimate aspects of our cultural history, skills, traditions, which are passed down for thousands of years. Alaska Native art not only plays a critical role in preserving cultural ways of doing and speaking, but perhaps more than ever now plays an important role in our local community's economic landscape. Today, I share a perspective on cultural advocacy through the lens of community planning and development. And we are a region of diverse cultural presence and growing resilience on the cash economy. We have a lot of people use cash, subsistence-based economy. We very much have folks that rely on the natural resources to put food on the table still to this day. And through that practice, we are given the opportunity to utilize the byproducts from the animals that sustain our families and our communities, and therefore art plays a role, a very important role. It is critical to be mindful of the interconnectedness between our thriving Indigenous culture, continued dependence, and respect of our natural resources, and the ever-changing economic landscape with each of our communities, which are all unique in themselves. The artist community is a perfect example of this interconnectedness between culture, natural resources, and economy. The Bering Straits region is home to a diverse group of artists, from beaters to skin sewers to world-renowned ivory carvers. COERC is committed to advocating for the tools and resources that support the arts and support the artists and the precious art that they create. So there's that foundation that we're working from, and that's so important to share and to have folks hopefully understand that there's very much a human element to our cultural advocacy, and the importance not only to the health and well-being, cultural identity preservation, and now more than ever economic outcomes. And this Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990 hits home. It hits home. It has a direct effect on the artists that do art here in our region. For those that are not familiar with the law, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990 is a truth in advertising law that prohibits misrepresentation in the marketing of Indian arts and craft products within the United States. The amendments to the bill and to the regulations are an attempt to modernize the bill. It's been a while since it's been updated, and clarify the language by adding additional protections and clarifications for Native artists across the country. And Cynthia and Westaf have done an amazing job putting together a list of resources. And I think those are available to learn more about the act and all the details. It's pretty complicated. And responding to the opportunity to comment on the law itself and the regulations was pretty important. And to be able to turn those comments around quickly was critical. And and we are thankful that West Staff was able to provide us with a primer to help us navigate the legal jargon in these two documents. So we are very grateful for West staff and Cynthia for providing that tool. We were also, one of the reasons we were able to respond is also the Alaska State Council on the Arts staff notified us of these changes. So through the Arts Network, through the ASCA and through West staff, we were able to have the tools and resources to be able to respond. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. And I just wanted to uplift something that you mentioned that I know that we as panelists talked about in our prep call for this panel is like the importance of network and how the information gets passed from one another, and the importance of sharing that information and how it helps when we're able to engage and activate the people and the right people at the right time. And I think a lot of that is through the power of coalition and network. So thank you. And as Alice mentioned, those resources regarding kind of more details about the Indian Arts and Crafts Act are in the resources page of the event. So feel free to take a look at that when you have a moment. And I'm going to move us to Bertrand to talk a little bit about his work with the Performing Arts Alliance. So we know that Performing Arts Alliance has been tracking anti-drag legislation and providing resources to the field on how to protect LGBTQIA+ artists. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of your work in developing partners and alliances on that front? And what are some things that arts advocates can do to support these efforts? Considering we're in January, we're moving into new legislative sessions across the states. What are you seeing on that front, Bertrand?
Yeah, so a little context as well. Performing Arts Alliance has been around for a long while. However, during 2020, during the racial reckoning that happened, we were fortunate enough to be able to diversify our board and diversify the issues that we worked on, and really refocus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what equitable advocacy looks like. And so when I started a little over a year ago, this was right before these attacks began. And we were in the process of exploring what are some diverse but also inclusive issues that we need to start taking on. And this was obviously very topical and very current. And it was also a bit of a challenge because there wasn't federal legislation being passed. However, we couldn't ignore it just because it's not necessarily our purview. Because, as I said, there are many artists who are transgender, and we have spent long enough excluding people and not looking out for folks. And so when the anti-drag legislation in places like Tennessee and Florida came out, that was sort of the first dog whistle that perked our ears up. And because, of course, not only is it wrong, it's also a really serious attack on who can do what and who can say what and where. And so we spoke up about that, but also as we started to engage with community and speak to people who were more experienced with the issue, it was made clear that this was part of a much larger attack on transgender people. And so we widened our scope as well, because it's important to have a holistic view and not be distracted by specific aspects, because that just leads to division. And so what was so key for us was developing new relationships as we were entering a new issue. and building new coalitions and making ourselves known in new communities. And so we were really starting from zero with that. And one thing that I highlighted in our prep call was that a lot of what Alice and Heather was talking about was we're working in coalitions that had already been built, which is tremendous work and cannot be undervalued, like you said, Cynthia. And so we were sort of starting that process from scratch. And so what that looked like was a lot of Zoom calls, meeting with people who represent drag artists, who represent trans artists, who are trans artists, in various artistic disciplines, as well as meeting with art service organizations who also have a federal perspective. And let's see. And so I think what the needle we were trying to thread is how can we provide support and resources without overstepping our limitations legally as an organization with a federal scope. And we found that a lot of the asks that were coming from us were to ensure that our spaces as artistic spaces were safe places that they could go to, and as well as the people who work in these theaters, in these clubs, in these performing arts centers could continue to come to work and feel safe. And as well as speaking up, because each of your local organizations has influence. And we have in many communities around the country, we have member organizations. And so encouraging those folks to speak up, but also giving them a little guidance on how they can talk about it and what an effective way to talk about it is. And then really identifying partners that folks can look to in their local communities to continue to do this work on their own. So a lot of, like Heather said, capacity building and guidance on what you need to be able to advocate for folks in your community.
Thank you, Bertrand, for that. And I just wanted to underscore something that you said that I think I heard all of the panelists mention was the importance of that coalition work and the relationship building and that trust building. I think so often we don't value that kind of relationship building work in the same way that we value other like key performance measures. But when push comes to shove and you need to be able to put together and turn a letter around really quickly, you need to already have that trust in place. I think of Alice, how quickly you were able to contact folks in your community to put comments together because you've already had those relationships in place. So thank you for that, those comments. I think we're going to move into the next section of questions, which is going to be a little bit more tactical, but still thinking about the kind of the tactical aspects of this. And it's going to be open to all of you. So whoever wants to go first, floor is open. So the question is, how can advocates figure out which state or federal agencies is in charge of implementing programs or policies that impact the issues that they care about? And then that's one. And then part two is, how can they start developing relationships with those targeted agencies? And this is an opportunity perhaps for you to talk about some other issues. I know that in our pre-call, we talked a little bit about ticketing, we talked a little bit about ed. So anything you want to bring up there?
I can go a little bit. And so I think that a little Google goes a long way. Because when in working with artists, I find that often the advocacy issue is underneath the problem. So the problem might be my artist hasn't been able to get their visa and we're not sure they're going to be able to come in time. However, there's an administrative reason as to why that's happening, as well as a policy reason, as well as a legislative reason, as to how all that comes to be to a real situation. And so I would recommend just starting with Googling your problem, and finding out which agencies oversee it, because it may be multiple, and it may be federal, and it may be state. And if that doesn't tell you what you need to know, your elected officials are great resources for this. You can call your federal elected officials, as well as your state and local. And there are people on the staff whose job it is to help you navigate these systems. And you can go to them and tell them your problem, and they will route it straight to the person. Well, not straight to the person, but to the person who needs to see it, or the agency. And they'll also give you feedback and call you back and let you know. As well as community organizing, finding organizations in your community that care about this cause, speaking with the people who work there, as well as people who are deeply involved. And they can give you a more personal rundown of how these issues have developed and grown, and how they've impacted people in your community. I have come to tend to assume I'm not the first person to have a problem. Sometimes I am, but normally I'm not. And that has really changed my mindset in terms of, instead of just looking for a solution, looking for communities of people who are also experiencing the same friction.
Yeah, I would just echo. I'm sorry, go ahead, Alice.
Oh,
Were you going to jump in?
oh, that's okay. I'll go after you. Thank you, Heather.
I was just going to echo that we often look at other communities beyond the arts that are also sharing these issues with their expertise. And one of the beauties of being in a coalition is that you get to spread the knowledge around and the experience around. And so very much like you were saying, Cynthia, on the trust building too, we trust that others in some of our coalitions will be the first to hear about a regulatory moment that we maybe haven't discovered yet. But we also look beyond our art circles. So we've gotten connected with the Small Business Administration's Office of the Advocate, and they automatically comment on nearly every federal rulemaking of all kinds. And they'll ping us now and say, hey, I think this one might matter to you. Also on the visa issues, especially in our early days when we're just getting our footing on this, we relied on groups like the American Immigration Lawyers Association, who got the context of the big picture on the policy arena we're in. It can help us make sense of, so where are some of these landmines we might not be aware of? Who might be our natural allies that we haven't even thought of yet? And I'll also say that both in those advocacy circles and then also in the federal agencies, they really do count on us to uniquely tell the story only we know. And so that's where the data we can bring about how we know things, who's in our sector that's impacted by the issue, but also the really specific real world implications. How does this work in the real world, this role they're considering? Sometimes it feels like, oh, those folks in Washington don't want to hear from us, but actually without us telling those stories with data, very clear examples and solutions, like instead of doing this, do this instead in your rulemaking. They really can't make the right decisions without that information. They're counting on it. They read every single public comment. I think they take into account and give heavier weight to those that are clearly not a cookie cutter, one of the same 1,000 responses, and those that are data backed. But just for fun, if you want to cruise the Federal Register and look at not proposed rules, but the draft final rules, like the second time the agency goes out to ask for input, they summarize what they heard back from the public. And it's very interesting to just take a look at that, to be encouraged that the things you and your coalition partners say will be heard. It will land.
I'll agree with Heather too. Cross-industry connections and partnerships are definitely key, especially in the economic development landscape and that cross-sector with the arts. I also wanted to mention that I think actively and proactively advocating on a consistent basis, building partnerships and collaborations through the work of advocacy, you learn new avenues of finding out information or tools and resources available. And I just bring that up because of the work that, for example, that WestAC did for us. If it wasn't for our participation in workshops or committees, and being able to go to events and learn about these resources, I think that's a huge benefit to cultural advocacy and learning about laws or federal agency program changes. Also internally, traveling out and going to our communities. I wanted to add, and I should have added this earlier, but part of the reason why I think we were able to have a quick turnaround time with our comments and to the changes that were being recommended for the Indian Arts and Crafts Act was we had done a survey of artists, 172 artists in our region, and we had some data and some feedback that we were able to share and consider while putting the comments together. Even through that work, also building relationships and trust within our communities, and that opens up forms of communication and learning about what's happening on the ground. But definitely building relationships with staffers and lawmakers. Some people say, it's the staffers you need to build relationships with. They know the story. Also within the tribal communities, understanding the tribal community landscapes up here in Alaska. We have Native corporations, tribal leaders, we have municipal governments, we have tribal offices, and understanding that landscape and the flow of information in and through those communities, I think is also very important. There are regional organizations that play a critical role in informing our organization on upcoming legal I don't know how you say it, changes or laws or new bills or acts that are being, resolutions that are being introduced. So it can get pretty robust with the network of cultural advocacy and who you can turn to for information.
All right, thank you. I want to do a quick summary, and then I'm going to move us into one last question, and I do want to make sure we have a little time for Q&A. But thank you for sharing that about the importance of how to identify opportunities through network and coalition and partnership. And then I think it's great to hear about that there really can be tangible change made when you approach an agency with solutions instead of just identifying this is a problem. When you come with a solution and data and stories of how those changes can actually tangibly impact your communities, I think they're much more open to implementing those changes. So I'm going to take us to our last question. We'll do a quick round robin for the panelists. I know we have a few issues that we weren't able to squeeze into this hour, but if there's something that, what are some opportunities that we haven't already talked about for advocates today to take action on, if you want to just do a quick highlight, and then a last pitch for why it's important for artists, arts organizations, and administrators to be tracking things like regulatory advocacy. And maybe I'll just start with Heather.
Sure. So I'll take the second question first,
Okay.
which is that these policy actions and regulatory moments happen at a much more predictable pace than legislation. And so I think most of our coalition colleagues, we've kind of taken the view that never miss an opportunity for a public comment when it's offered. Even if the issue that they're framing is just tangential to the one you care about, it's a chance to go on record. And this is, and know that your comment doesn't just go to the agency, it's publicly available as well. So anyone who's interested in that issue is going to be able to see what your voice on that issue is. So especially when we enter into this next year where legislative action will be highly unpredictable, we know that this administration, nearing the end of its first term, wants to do as much as it can under its current authority and the time left. So it's a perfect time to get really engaged in this process. Two issues come to mind. One is one that just impacts at all levels, and that's around music education advocacy and arts education advocacy. So those policy decisions about what happens with the federal education law we have, those decisions are being made school by school, locality by locality, district, and at the state level all of the time. So I know most here are already fully engaged in those arts education alliances at the state and local level, but I can't help but say this is one where the urgency to act is always present to close gaps in access to arts education. And we've actually been working with Congress to influence the federal agency just through writing letters to the agency. So even as Alice was saying, as you're working with your congressional leaders and their staff, there's action they can take during these policy and regulatory moments outside of legislation. And then the other issue is we actually currently have an open federal comment period that you might like to engage in, and that's related to transparency in ticketing policies. There's a current Federal Register notice that closes, timeframe was extended to accommodate this webinar, I'm sure. They extended the comment period to February 7th. And this is a really just quick example of how sometimes you don't know if it's your issue until it's spelled out to you. If you're seeing headlines that relate to junk fees and policies, that might mean you, even if you're not engaged in offering up junk fees. This is actually a policy that relates to every single ticket sold, or even any goods and services that are offered to your audiences or consumers. And we've got, I think, a link in the resources that just unpacks that issue a little bit more for you. It's a great moment where when we looked at the draft policies, it was clear that they actually forgot to count performing arts organizations as impacted entities by this rule, right? And there was no comment on the nonprofit nature of the nonprofit side of that sector. Mm-hmm. So these are, examples of if they don't know, and you're not there to tell them, their policy won't be informed.
All right, Bertrand, Alice?
Just, I guess, closing comments. Learn about the Native populations in your states. What Native groups are indigenous to your area. Understand organizations that support the Native communities. Build partnerships and relationships with those organizations, learn about policies that affect Native arts and culture, learn a little bit about the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, and it's pretty important to protecting the Native art in our country, and look towards having expertise on your planning groups or committees. Invite Indigenous folks to the table and to share, and also visit the NASA website. I'll plug in the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. They have a phenomenal arts advocacy toolkit you could download. That's actually how I learned about that organization, was their arts toolkit and how to advocate for the arts in the legislative process. So that's a great resource. But thank you.
Yeah, I think, barring what was already mentioned, I would say get involved. And like I said, sometimes it can be kind of overwhelming to try and find like different laws and different regulations. So just start with your everyday life and the things that affect your everyday life. And maybe you can do an exercise like, what would I do if this stopped? What would I do if this is if this grant money stopped? And that's on like the local and state level as well as how can this be better? What are some of the pain points that we have in interacting with these government bodies? And build that out in coalition, in community, and have just candid kitchen table style conversations. And from there, you're gonna start realizing like, okay, well, somebody should do something about this. Somebody can do something about this, and I think that's a great place to start your research. Once you've talked about it and how it impacts you on a like practical level. And then in terms of resources, Data Arts has a great arts advocacy training. The League of American Orchestras has a really nice advocacy calendar. They talk about building relationships throughout the year and things that you should be cognizant of. That's really great. And then Performing Arts Alliance, we have some toolkits as well on how to advocate for the arts.
Great. Okay, so thank you for your comments. And I also think this is an opportunity for West Staff to plug. I dropped in the chat. If you're wanting to stay up to date, you're welcome to sign up onto our advocacy email list. We have advocacy alerts as well that we run. And I see that we have 2 questions from the audience, and I'm going to do my best to maybe combine them because I think we could probably address a little of both. So we have a question from Andrew and a question from Kara. And Andrew asks, you spoke about the importance of presenting solutions. What is your approach to developing those solutions? And how do you go about engaging? Like, how can you come forth with solutions? And then Kara asks, what can we do to help our state arts agencies? Can we host surveys, compile images? It's a little bit of a leading question there because I'm kind of thinking that is part of the answer, but interested to hear what our panelists have to say.
I could talk really briefly about crafting the solution, but it kind of comes in 2 parts. So one is you have to demonstrate to your policy audience that you've tried to work within the rules they currently have, whether it's guidelines they've written for how their grants work, or in our case, immigration policy, the policy manuals that they give to people who process the visa. So first we have to prove to them we tried complying with the rules you've crafted. And we have some examples to show you of where it's not working. So real world examples matter. Otherwise, they might come to you and say, well, you just haven't followed the guidance we've put out, or you're just not aware of how the rules work, right? So first you have to pressure test and show them current rules we have don't work. The other big ingredient then, so you say, so if you change the policy in this way, we won't have this barrier to access, or we'll be able to get the visa in time. And one critical thing where you might need to look for some partners to help you, and we have with some terrific immigration lawyers at a group called Counterstat on a visa policy, is we just had to make sure that the agency had the authority to implement the solution we came up with, right? So for us, the big thing that we had to get across to make the agency feel like we were in a productive dialogue is reassure them they would not have to go to Congress and get the law changed in order to do the thing we're asking their help with. They have authority under their current rules to change the policy manual in this way, and it won't come up against immigration law. Sometimes you get into a highly technical space like that, where you need some help from folks who know that law inside and out, and can help solve that question. But in other spaces, when it comes to something just like ways in which grant guidelines could be improved, or ways in which an agency can make more noise, in our case around Title I funding and eligibility for arts education, we're really just asking the federal government to speak up more about it, right? They're already on record what the rules are. We just need them to use their voice to elevate it. So sometimes the solutions aren't so technical in nature, but you just need to really clearly spell them out.
I'll add to that, thinking about the process we went through with the Indian Arts and Crafts Act comments and regulations. When we developed the response comments, we always try to add a solution. If we disagreed with an approach or terminology, there was always a suggestion there. And also part of that was really understanding the context behind. It's one thing to have the writing in black and white on paper, but what's behind it? What's motivating that? And going and trying to learn and get some context behind who's writing that or the organization. And we were so fortunate to have a retired commissioner of the Indian Arts and Crafts Act living here in Nome. So we were able to kind of, hey, by the way, are you familiar with this? And again, those partnerships and those relationships are so important to solution, driven outcomes. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Cynthia, could you repeat the second question?
Yeah, it was a bit of a combination, but it's how do we go about basically proposing solutions? Is surveying, sending images, is that helpful for advocacy?
Yeah, I think. I mean, have any of you ever sent images in?
Oh,
That's great. Yeah, because I think that those provide a different type of context, especially when you're trying to be as inclusive as possible. Because for some people, expressing themselves through written word isn't the best way to get their point across. So I think that's a great idea.
All right. Well, we've got 2 minutes to spare for the end of the hour, and I think I'm going to use moderator privileges and wrap us up. I wanted to make sure that we do a little housekeeping, and thank you, panelists, for all of your insightful information. I wanted to point the audience, especially to our resource page, because there you can find the actual examples of some of the comments that have been submitted. We're not trying to gatekeep how to write comments. We want people to be able to be inspired by others and do the same and take action on their own. And other ways to take action is you're welcome to sign up to West Staff's advocacy alerts. That is also, the link is in the chat and also has been shared on the resources page. And I wanted to thank especially our West Staff event staff, Brittany Howell and Natalie Sherlong, for their support on this webinar. And shout out the next 2 dates of our webinar, which will be Wednesday, March 27th and Wednesday, May 29th. And those will both be 2 p.m. Mountain Time. And you can feel free to register for those the same way that you registered for this webinar. And I think that's it. And if you have any feedback on how we can improve our webinars and all of that, we'll be sending out a survey, and we look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully you can stay engaged with us and continue learning together with us. And I think that's it.
Great. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.